Let's go to our panel now. In Mexico City, we have two guests. Gretchen Kuhner is director of the Institute for Women in Migration. John Ackerman is also there in the Mexican capital. He's a law professor and editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review. And in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Mike Vigil joins us. He led international operations for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Mike spent more than a decade in Mexico. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us on the Newsmakers. Gretchen, under refugee conventions, people are given protection if they're persecuted because they belong to a specific social group, particularly a minority religion, or if they're targeted by their government. By that definition alone, is Mexico doing anything wrong by deporting, since 2014, more than 500,000 Central Americans?
Yes, and the problem with the situation in Mexico is not so much the law. The refugee law is fine. It agrees with the convention. Mexico has ratified the convention. The issue is that Mexico detains and deports Central Americans without any due process, and the information about how to apply for asylum in Mexico is often unavailable to them. So Mexico has a good refugee system on paper, but the application is severely lacking. The organization that's in charge of adjudicating asylum applications in Mexico, the Kuhner, it only has 3 offices in the whole country and about 27 protection officers, whereas they have 52 detention centers and over 6,000 immigration agents. And so there's a big discrepancy between the amount of protection that can be given to asylum seekers in Mexico and the ability of Mexico to detain and deport people.
Mike, that narrow, rather narrow definition that I've just given, it doesn't take into consideration the fact that in Latin America, criminal gangs are often working directly with police and politicians. Can you give us some examples of what you saw during your experience in Mexico in this regard?
Well, the problem with Mexico is that you have endemic corruption. So you have a lot of collusion there between security forces of that country to some of the most powerful and violent drug trafficking consortiums that operate in that country. Apart from that, when these tens of thousands of migrants come in from the Northern Triangle, consisting of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, they go from the frying pan into the fire because probably about 2/3 of them are subjected to violence in Mexico. 1/3 of the women that go into Mexico suffer from sexual assault. So you have a country where 12 of the most violent cities of the 50 most violent in the world exist in Mexico. You have a lot of the government officials that also abuse these migrants. The cartels abduct 20,000 of these migrants every year, and they put them into the sex slave trade, into forced labor. They extort them, they kidnap them, and then they hold them for ransom, and those that don't pay are sometimes killed. So it's a horrific situation. And then when you combine the brutal Trump policies of separating individuals' kids from their families, these people are in a crush of a political maelstrom that is a horrific situation. But Mexico is acting as a surrogate, if you will, of the Trump policies. But Mexico is very unsuitable for these immigrants to seek asylum.
Gretchen, this violence that Mike is talking about, do you meet many migrants and refugees who regret coming to Mexico looking for a safer place to live?
Well, a lot of people, especially from Central America, aren't coming to Mexico to seek asylum in Mexico. They have family members and networks in the United States. They're in danger. They're fleeing for their lives, often with their families since 2014. And they're really trying to reach the United States because that's where they have better support. However, a lot of them get stuck in Mexico or end up requesting asylum in Mexico because of all of the violence and extortion and all of the things that were just described. And so what we find is that it's not that they regret it, because maybe they're in a shelter in Mexico, maybe they can get refugee status in Mexico, but issues like where am I going to work, how am I going to get access to education for my children, how am I going to have access to health services, all of those issues are very difficult for asylum seekers and refugees in Mexico.
John, those numbers are staggering, aren't they? Since 2014, more than 500,000 Central Americans deported from Mexico. Last year, 82,000. And since 2015, Mexico has deported more Central Americans annually than U.S. authorities have done. How is it such a big problem for Mexico?
Yeah, I think my colleagues are absolutely correct. The two big problems are corruption. The Mexican government is, up till now, been very much in cahoots with rings of organized crime. And on the other hand, there has been a terrible, servile attitude to Washington, United States. Our last few administrations in Mexico have basically been, acting as surrogates, as an extension of the U.S. Border control down to, the southern border with Central America. And so, that's why Mexico is deporting so many Central Americans and sort of doing the dirty work for the United States. The shame here is, as Gretchen mentioned, we actually do have excellent migration laws on the books in Mexico. They're very progressive, very humanitarian. They dictate to the Mexican government sort of a need to support the migrants as they pass through the United States. It's not a repressive law. It's trying to actually support requests for asylum. But in the end, the politics coming down through Washington and passed right through the Mexican government has been, basically repression, control, and jailing and criminalizing these migrants. Now, there's a hope for this to change. Of course, we just had a big president's election, July 1st. A new administration is coming in on December 1st, and is trying to explore different options. So as to have a more humanitarian approach from Mexico and a more brotherly, sisterly attitude towards Central America. So that does bring in some hope for the future.
Well, we'll come on to AMLO in a few minutes, but what you say about the Mexican state supporting and understanding it needs to support people who come into the country, the numbers don't bear that out, though, do they? Because if 82,000 people were deported just from Central America alone back to their homelands, 14,000 applications for asylum were processed last year. So that means, what, roughly out of the 100,000 that came to ask for asylum, officially asked for asylum, only 14,000 were allowed to stay.
Exactly. Yeah. No. I mean, the laws are great, but the implementation is terrible. Mexico, is under a lot of pressure from the United States to, push back the migrants to their homeland instead of, allowing for a more humanitarian transition toward the United States or within Mexico itself. And so that has been the problem precisely. We've been from Mexico expelling, tens of thousands of Central American migrants and doing the work for Washington. That's what needs to change.
Mike, what, in your experience, again, with the Mexican authorities when you were living there and directing these operations for the DEA, how were they dealing with the situation of people using, either Mexicans themselves or other Central Americans, using the country as a transit route to the United States? Were they complying with American demands and desires that be curtailed? Or was it almost a case of, yeah, great, we don't want you in our country, so go to North America, go further north into the United States?
Well, the issue is that we created the violence in the Northern Triangle because in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we deported a lot of gang members, particularly out of Southern California, the MS-13. We sent them back to the Northern Triangle. They proliferated like locusts and started to create tremendous violence. But make no mistake about it, Donald Trump labels these migrants as murderers, rapists, drug traffickers. These are very decent people seeking to escape horrific violence, looking for a better way of life. And the Trump administration has turned them away. has brutally repressed the asylum laws, separated children from their parents, which I think is thuggish, and is now pushing Mexico to follow suit. And I'm hoping that when Andres Manuel López Obrador comes into power on December the 1st, he changes Mexico's deportation laws, the asylum laws, because they are anemic. And it's not humanitarian to take these tens of thousands of migrants and kick them back to their country where they face death. They could ostensibly be killed. Mexico, along with the United States, is a country of immigrants. And these immigrants play a huge role in the economy of the United States. Donald Trump says that they take jobs away from U.S. citizens. That is a bald-faced lie. These are individuals that come in and do jobs that Americans don't want to do. They pay about $63 billion. They paid $63 billion during the last decade and have received absolutely no benefits from that money. So there's a lot of falsehoods being propagated by the Trump administration, and I find that completely deplorable.
Okay,
and
Mike.
It goes to show the racist policies.
Okay, if you don't mind, just to John, you mentioned AMLO, incoming president. The pressure from the United States is intense, and President Trump, as everybody knows, is using NAFTA and its potential future as a way to beat Mexico, to do something about immigrants coming north from Mexico into the United States. What is AMLO going to do? What is the best he can do? And can he deliver on that best?
Well, López Obrador has been very clear about what his policy is going to be. It's going to be a humanitarian policy in favor of development, right? So he's actually, in the initial stages, gotten along with Trump, surprisingly. López Obrador say he agrees that he doesn't want to be pushing all the migrants up to the United States, but he wants to be able to create economic development in Mexico and in Central America as well, so that people have the right to stay in their communities. Have good jobs and have basic economic welfare, and not have that need to migrate. And that is the solution, not more walls or more repression. So there's a lot of hope among the Mexican people and migrant activists that López Obrador will be able to follow through with this promise. And in the end, if it's successful, we get economic development in the southern part of Mexico, particularly in Central America. This will actually solve, Trump's problem, this, racist attitude, of course. I agree absolutely with my colleague. But in the end, this would stop migration and it should satisfy Trump. So we might be able to have a kind of meeting of the minds here between two very different leaders, but in the end, being able to stop migration and increased development in Mexico and Central America would in the end be in the benefit of everybody.
Gretchen, John, Mike, really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.